The arm was the first thing, not the face, not the clothes, not the way he'd called ahead twice before actually showing up. Which, for the record, is its own kind of tell. It was the arm. The way it moved when he started laying the bills out on my desk, one after another, each one placed with the same careful, repeating motion. Shoulder swinging forward, hand coming down flat. Shoulder swinging forward, hand coming down flat. Like the elbow joint had just decided one day it wasn't going to be part of the operation anymore, and the rest of the arm had quietly worked around it. I watched that arm for 4 bills before I made myself stop watching. You learn, in this work, not to stare at the thing that's wrong. You look at it once, you file it, you move your eyes somewhere neutral and let the person keep talking. Rodney Figg was talking about his son. He'd been talking about his son since he sat down, in that patient, measured way some people have. The kind of voice that sounds like it's been trained to project calm into a room, to slow things down, to make you feel like you're the one being a little too quick about everything. He'd been a school teacher, he told me. Retired. 31 years at a secondary school in Setúbal. That's the kind of detail a person volunteers when they want you to know they're trustworthy, which is also the kind of detail I've learned to set aside and look at later. His name was Rodney Figg, 67, give or take. Tall, but the kind of tall that started to fold in on itself at the shoulders. White hair combed flat to one side. Pale gray eyes that didn't move around the room the way nervous eyes do. They stayed on me, steady and attentive, which some people would find reassuring, and which I found, in the moment, mildly exhausting. My office, such as it is, sits above a hardware shop on Rua do Século. 2 rooms, 1 window, a desk that came with the place, and a chair I brought myself because the desk chair was the kind of thing you'd report to a health inspector. I'd been there since just after noon. It was getting toward 4 when Rodney Figg arrived. He finished counting out the bills, 12 of them, which covered the retainer I'd quoted over the phone, and set his hands flat on the desk with a kind of finality, like a man who has just completed a transaction he'd been rehearsing. "Wesley," he said, "my son, he's 29. I pulled a notepad toward me and looked for a pen. This is where the card came into it. I've got a jacket I wear for client meetings. Dark, bit worn at the cuffs, deep pockets. I keep things in those pockets that I keep meaning to move somewhere else and never do. Receipts, a folded bus map that's 2 years out of date, a pen that stopped working in October and that I keep putting back in there for reasons I couldn't explain under oath. What I found first, digging around for something to write with, was a business card. Stiff, slightly bent at one corner. I pulled it out and looked at it without meaning to. Policia Judiciaria. Andy Santiago's name below that, a number, an address in Chiado. I knew the card. I'd had it since a case 2 years back, a surveillance job that turned complicated in a way I hadn't anticipated. And Andy had been the officer who'd made it possible to close things out without anyone ending up in a room they didn't want to be in. We weren't friends. It wasn't that kind of relationship. But he dealt straight with me, and I dealt straight with him. And at the end of it, I'd written something on the back of his card in my own handwriting, and kept it. I flipped the card over. My own writing, in the cramped shorthand I use when I'm writing fast. Do not call unless the case cannot be closed any other way. I don't know exactly what I was thinking when I wrote that. Something about keeping that particular door closed unless things got bad enough that it was the only door left. Andy Santiago had institutional weight I didn't have. And institutional weight has a way of solving problems by flattening everything in the vicinity, including things you didn't want flattened. So, last resort, that was the idea. I looked at the card for maybe 3 seconds, then put it in my inside pocket, found the broken pen underneath it, found a working one behind that, and wrote Rodney Figg's address on Rua da Saudade in my notepad. "Tell me when you last saw him," I said. Rodney Figg told me. 6 weeks ago, he said. Wesley had been living in a flat on Rua da Atalaya with 2 flatmates. And 6 weeks ago, he'd stopped returning calls, stopped answering the door, and the flatmates had eventually confirmed he wasn't there. Rodney Figg had gone to the police. The police had taken a report. Nothing had come of it. He said all of this with the same measured cadence. No catch in the voice. No moment where the composure slipped and the father showed through. Some people grieve quietly, I know that. Some people hold it together in front of strangers because falling apart in front of strangers is not something they're built to do. I've sat across from enough of them to know the difference between held together and absent, and I was still working out which one this was. Any reason he might have left on his own? I said. Disagreement, debt, relationship trouble. None that I'm aware of. Friends he might have gone to, someone he'd mentioned. Wesley kept to himself, Rodney Figg said. He was a private young man. I wrote that down, not because it was useful, but because writing things down gives you a moment to look at the notepad instead of the person across from you. And sometimes you need that. The arm. I kept coming back to the arm. The way it had moved through those 12 bills. Mechanical, deliberate, the same arc every time. And the way it now rested on the desk. The right hand flat. The elbow not quite at the angle you'd expect if you were sitting the way Rodney Figg was sitting. Like it had been placed there. Like the positioning of it was something that required a small, separate act of attention. Joint deterioration, maybe. Some kind of old injury. Or something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet and wasn't going to get a name for by sitting here staring at it. I told him I'd start the following morning. I told him the retainer covered 3 days of active work and that I'd report back at each stage. He nodded at all of this in a way that suggested he'd already known what I was going to say, which is either the sign of a man who'd done his research or the sign of a man who was very good at appearing to have expected things. He stood, straightened his jacket with his left hand, and walked out. I listened to his footsteps go down the stairs, even unhurried. And then the street door opened and closed. I sat there for a minute with a notepad in front of me. Wesley Figg, Rua da Atalaya, 6 weeks gone. Father on Rua da Saudade, retired school teacher, 31 years in Setúbal. Arm that swings from the shoulder like the elbow's been taken out of the equation. I reached into my inside pocket and put Andy Santiago's card on the desk where I could see it. Not because I was going to use it, just because I'd written what I'd written on the back of it, and I wanted it somewhere visible while I thought. The money was still on the desk, 12 bills, laid out in a neat row. I stacked them, put them in the drawer, and went to find something to eat before the light went. Rua da Atalaya runs uphill the way most streets in that part of the city do, narrow enough that you can touch both walls if you stretch your arms out, which I didn't do, but noticed you could. I got there around 9:30 in the morning. The sun was still low enough to be hitting the tiles on the upper facades, but not the street itself. So the whole walk-up was in shadow, cold in the way Lisbon gets cold in November. Not the temperature so much as the damp coming off the stone. The building was 3 floors, pale yellow paint going gray at the corners. A panel of buzzers by the door with handwritten names on strips of paper behind plastic. I found the flat number Rodney Figg had given me and pressed the button. Waited. Pressed it again. A voice came through the intercom, a woman's, asking who was there. I told her my name and said I was looking into Wesley Figg's whereabouts on behalf of his family. That's the language I use. On behalf of his family opens more doors than I'm a private investigator, which tends to make people picture something they saw in a film and then get careful. I wasn't lying. Rodney Figg was family. The door buzzed open. The flat was on the 2nd floor. The woman who answered was Zoe. She told me her name before I asked, which I noted, because people who lead with their name are usually people who have nothing to hide, or people who want you to think that. And she read clearly as the first kind. Small, dark hair, still in the kind of clothing you wear before you've decided what to do with your day. She had the door open wide, which also meant something. Xavier came out of the kitchen a minute later, drying his hands on a dish towel, and the two of them together made the small front room feel full. I told them what I'd told the intercom, looking into Wesley's whereabouts. His father was concerned. Zoe said, "We've been concerned too." Xavier nodded at that, folded the dish towel over the back of a chair. I asked them to walk me through the last time they'd seen him. This is always the part where you find out what kind of witnesses you're dealing with. Some people give you a wall of detail, most of it irrelevant, and you have to sift. Some people give you almost nothing, and you have to pull. These two were somewhere in the middle. Cooperative, clear enough, but the timeline had already softened at the edges the way timelines do after 6 weeks. They'd had time to talk about it between themselves, which means they'd had time to agree on what they remembered, which is not the same thing as what actually happened, but it's what you get. 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday, Zoe thought, or maybe a Wednesday. Wesley had been home in the morning, had breakfast, nothing unusual. Then in the afternoon, a man came to the door. Gray coat, she said, older, maybe 50 or 60, she wasn't sure. He had a way of moving that she noticed but couldn't quite describe. Xavier said stiff, and Zoe said not exactly stiff, more like deliberate. And they went back and forth on it for a moment the way people do when they both saw the same thing and are trying to find the right word for it together. I wrote down deliberate walk and gray coat and kept my face neutral. Wesley had gone to the door, talked to the man for a few minutes, then come back in and said he had to go out for a while. That was it. No argument, no agitation, nothing that read as wrong at the time. He'd taken his jacket and left with the man in the gray coat. And that was the last either of them had seen of him. No message after. No call. His phone went to voicemail and then eventually stopped connecting, which Zoe said had happened around the 2-week mark. "Did you call the police?" I asked. Zoe said she had about 3 weeks in. They'd taken a report. Nothing had come of it that she knew of. That tracked. A 29-year-old man leaving voluntarily with someone he apparently knew. No signs of distress, no crime scene. The police file would be thin and sitting somewhere in a queue with 100 others like it. I asked whether Wesley had seemed different in the days before he left. This is a question I always ask and rarely get useful answers to, but sometimes you do. Zoe looked at Xavier. Xavier looked at the dish towel on the chair. He'd been quieter, Zoe said. Not upset, just quieter, like he was thinking about something. Xavier said he was sleeping a lot. I wrote that down too, though I didn't know yet what to do with it. Then Zoe said she had a photograph, if that would help, and went to get it. She came back with a print, the kind you actually have developed, which you don't see as often anymore. She handed it to me and said one of Xavier's friends had taken it at a dinner 2 days before Wesley left. I looked at it. Wesley Figg was standing slightly left of center in the frame, a table behind him, other people at the edges. Slender, dark hair, a half smile like someone had just said something that almost landed. The image was clear enough. Good light. His left ear sat visibly lower on his skull than his right. Not a little lower. Enough that once you saw it, you couldn't not see it. The kind of thing that should have been immediately obvious to everyone in the room when the photo was taken. I kept my eyes moving across the whole image, the way you do when you don't want someone to see what you're looking at. The table, the background, the other faces, then back. It wasn't the angle. I know what a camera angle does to a face. I've spent enough time looking at photographs of people, surveillance shots, ID photos, images pulled from social media and printed out and laid on my desk, that I know the difference between distortion from a lens and something that is simply where it is. The ear was where it was. The geometry of his face around it was consistent. It wasn't the angle. Is that helpful? Zoe asked. It's useful. So I said, "Can I hold on to this?" She said yes. She looked at the photograph before I put it away, the way you look at something you've looked at before without really looking. "It's a bit odd, isn't it? How his ear looks." Xavier thought maybe the camera. "Could be," I said. Xavier said, "Yeah, probably just the angle." I put the photograph in my inside jacket pocket and asked a few more questions. The name of the man in the gray coat, which neither of them knew. Whether Wesley had mentioned anyone new in his life recently. Whether he had any reason to leave Lisbon suddenly. All of it came back empty or vague. They were trying. There just wasn't more there. I thanked them and left. Outside on Rua de Atalaya, I stood for a moment and let the cold settle back around me. I took the photograph out and looked at it again in the daylight. The ear, the half smile, the face that was almost but not quite the face it should have been. I thought about Rodney Figg's arm swinging from the shoulder in that slow, repeating arc. I put the photograph away. The flatmates had given me two things: a description of a man in a gray coat with a deliberate walk, and this photograph with a detail that neither of them had thought to question. That was it. That was the whole of what Rua de Atalaya had to offer. The trail didn't run through Zoe or Xavier. They'd told me everything they had, and it was already sitting in my pocket. Wherever the man in the gray coat had taken Wesley Figg 6 weeks ago, finding that man was the only way forward, and finding him was going to take time I didn't have a shortcut through. I started back down the hill. 3 nights of nothing is not unusual in this work. You show a description around. You get shrugs. You get people who half remember something that turns out to be someone else entirely. You get barmen who look at you like you're the problem for asking. I've had weeks of nothing. 3 nights is just the cost of entry sometimes. The first night I started near Rua de Atalaya and worked outward from there, which is what you do. You start where the person was last seen, and you move in the direction they moved. The man in the gray coat had walked Wesley Figg away from that building 6 weeks ago, which meant he'd gone somewhere, which meant he'd passed through streets, which meant someone might have noticed. Most people don't notice, but some do. I went to 9 places that first night. Got 4 people who didn't recognize the description at all. 3 who recognized the coat but not the walk. 1 woman running a small tabacaria on Rua do Norte who said she thought she knew who I meant, but then described someone completely different. And 1 barman who said he'd seen a man like that once, maybe, but couldn't place when or where. I wrote all of it down anyway. You write it down even when it's useless, because sometimes the pattern doesn't show itself until you're looking at everything together. Second night I pushed further west, toward Bica. Narrower streets down there, steeper. The kind of neighborhood where the buildings lean toward each other across the lane like they're having a conversation you're not part of. I talked to 6 people, got closer. 1 woman at a small restaurant on Rua de Bica said she thought she'd seen a man in a gray coat who walked in a way she remembered, not limping, more like he was placing each foot with some deliberate care, like he was thinking about the ground before he committed to it. But she hadn't seen him recently. Weeks, maybe more. She wasn't sure. I went home and lay on the bed above the Fado bar and listened to the music come up through the floorboards the way it did every night. And I thought about the walk. Deliberate, careful. Someone who moved like they were making decisions about movement rather than just moving. I'd seen people walk that way before, and it usually meant one of 2 things: pain they were managing or attention they were paying. I didn't know which one this was yet. Third night I went back to Bica and worked the street more carefully. That's when I found Dan Marshall. His bar was mid-block, nothing special to look at. A plain front, the name on the sign in faded lettering. 2 small tables outside that nobody was using because it was cold. Inside it smelled like the end of a long shift, damp wood and something frying somewhere in the back. Dan was behind the bar when I came in, wiping down the counter with the automatic efficiency of someone who does it without thinking about it anymore, which is most barmen after the first year. I ordered a coffee and let him bring it before I said anything. That's the other thing about this work. You don't lead with the question. You let the transaction happen first. People are more willing to talk to someone who's bought something than to someone who's only there to take. I gave him the description. Gray coat, unusual walk, deliberate, came through this area regularly. He didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said, I know who you mean. Just like that. After 3 nights of partial recognitions and near misses, just like that. He told me the man came in twice a week, sometimes 3 times if the week ran long, and he always ordered mineral water, never drank it. Dan had noticed because you notice the ones who don't drink what they order. It's the kind of thing that sits wrong behind a bar, a full glass just sitting there while the person sits with it. The man always took the same table near the back wall, the one that put him at an angle to the door, and also, Dan said, closest to the rear of the building. He just sits there, Dan said. Doesn't talk to anyone, doesn't look at his phone. He just sits and listens. I asked what he was listening to. Dan pointed generally at the wall behind him. There's a fado place on the next block. When the wind's right and the doors open, you can hear it in here. Not well, but you can hear it. I sat with that for a moment. A man who ordered water and didn't drink it and sat in the back of the bar twice a week to listen to music filtering through a wall from a venue he could have walked to in 2 minutes. I thanked Dan and paid for the coffee and left him a decent tip because he'd given me 3 nights worth of work in 5 minutes, and that has value whether or not he knew it. Then I settled in to wait. Watching a bar from the outside is tedious in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't done it. You find a position that gives you a sight line without putting you in direct view of the entrance, and then you stay there, and the cold works its way in through your jacket, and you think about other things and then remind yourself not to think about other things. And the street does its ordinary business around you. People going home, couples arguing quietly. The distant sound of trams. You become part of the background. That's the whole trick of it. First night watching, nothing. Second night, nothing. Third night, I nearly talked myself into moving to a different approach, which is the mistake you make when the waiting starts to feel like the problem rather than the method. Fourth night, he came. I saw him from half a block away. The walk was exactly what the woman on Rua de Bica had said. Deliberate, considered, each step placed with a small pause before the weight transferred. Like someone crossing ice they weren't certain would hold. The coat was gray, long, slightly too formal for the neighborhood. He was average height, maybe a little under. I couldn't make out his face at that distance in that light, but I didn't need to. The walk was enough. He went into the bar. I waited. 35 minutes, maybe 40. He came back out and turned left, moving back the way he'd come, but then cutting right into a narrower lane I hadn't been watching. I went after him. The lane ran along the back of a row of buildings, then opened into a small passage I didn't have a name for at the time. I looked it up later. It was an access lane connected to one of the old aqueduct infrastructure routes. The kind of thing that's on city maps, but that you'd never find unless you were looking for it, or following someone who already knew it was there. The man in the gray coat moved through it without slowing down, without checking behind him. He knew where he was going. I kept my distance and kept my footsteps quiet. The stone underfoot was uneven and damp, and I had to watch where I put my feet, which meant I was splitting my attention between the ground and his back, which is not ideal. But I didn't lose him. He came out of the passage onto a short stretch of street and past a door set into the wall on the left side without looking at it. I looked at it. Heavy door, institutional. A small metal plate beside it with lettering I couldn't read from moving distance. He kept walking and I kept following, and then I stopped. He had crouched down in the middle of the street. Not the sidewalk. The street itself. The cobblestones. He crouched, got his fingers into something I couldn't see from where I was standing, and lifted. A grate. Iron, from the sound of it setting against the stone. He lowered himself through the opening with the same deliberate care he gave every movement. And then he was gone, and the street was empty. I stood there for a moment. Just a moment. Then I went to the door I'd passed and got my phone out and photographed it. The metal plate read, Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia in plain lettering. I photographed the door, the plate, the surrounding wall, the angle of the street. Sent it all to Rodney Figg with a short message, door on the route, possible point of interest. The reply came back fast. Too fast, really, for someone who was supposed to be a worried father waiting on news. Voice message, not text. That's not the right entrance, Rodney Figg said in that same measured, unhurried voice he'd used when he counted out my fee. Keep looking. I stood in the empty street with my phone in my hand and played the message back once more. Not because I'd missed anything, just because I wanted to hear the certainty in it again. That's not the right entrance. Not, I don't think that's it, or could be something else. The right entrance. Like there was a right one, specifically, and he already knew what it was. I pocketed the phone and looked at the grate. Whatever Rodney Figg was or wasn't telling me, the man in the gray coat had gone down through that iron square and the cobblestones on Rua de Oliveira and hadn't come back up. That was what I had. That was what I was going to stay with. I found a position in a doorway set back from the street and settled in to watch the grate, and I waited for something to come back up through it. The man in the gray coat came back the following night. I'd been in the doorway since 9, which is my way of saying I'd been standing in a recessed entry on Rua de Oliveira for about 3 hours with a cold that had settled into my sinuses somewhere around midnight and wasn't planning to leave. The cobblestones were wet, not raining, just that particular Lisbon damp that comes up off the river and sits on everything. My shoes were soaked through by Tim. He came around the corner at midnight. Same walk, same coat, same unhurried rhythm that shouldn't have looked wrong, but did. I waited until he'd passed my position, and then I came out of the doorway and fell in behind him, keeping about 20 meters back, which is closer than I'd normally go. But the street was empty enough that distance would have been its own kind of signal. He went straight for the grate. No hesitation, no checking the street. He just crouched, got his fingers under the iron lip, and lifted it the way you'd lift something you'd lifted 100 times before. The grate came up clean and he set it aside on the cobblestones and went down feet first, his gray coat folding in after him, and then he was gone. I gave it 30 seconds. Counted them out. Not because 30 seconds is some magic number, but because I needed to make sure he wasn't going to come back up. Then I crossed the street and looked down through the hole. Stone steps. A ladder, really. Iron rungs set into the wall. Below that, dark. I could hear water. Not running water, standing water. The kind of stillness that has its own sound if the space is big enough. I went down. The rungs were slick, and I took them slow, one hand on the wall. And when my foot hit the bottom, I stood still for a moment and let my eyes adjust. There wasn't much to adjust to. Whatever light existed down there was coming from somewhere I couldn't see yet, ambient and faint. The kind of light that makes shapes out of nothing and then takes them back. The ceiling was vaulted. That was the first thing I could actually make out. The arch of it, stone fitted against stone. Old in a way that the word old doesn't really cover. Roman era, I found out later. Though standing there in the dark, I just knew it was older than anything I had a right to be standing under. The air smelled like wet limestone and something else underneath it. Something I didn't have a name for then. Not decay. Not exactly. More like the smell of something that had been still for a very long time. The cistern ran back into the dark in both directions. Channels cut into the floor held black water, perfectly still, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters deep. My footsteps didn't echo so much as disappear. The stone absorbed sound the way heavy cloth does. I followed the direction the man in the gray coat had gone, or the direction I thought he'd gone. Kept my flashlight low, pointed at the floor. Maybe 50 meters in, the passage opened into a wider chamber, and and I swept the light up and around, and there was nobody there, just stone and water and the vaulted ceiling going up higher than the light reached. I stood in the middle of the chamber and listened. Nothing. He was gone. Somewhere ahead or to the side, there were passages I hadn't seen yet, and he'd taken one of them, and I wasn't going to find him tonight. That was clear enough. What wasn't clear was what I was seeing along the far wall. Alcoves, 8 of them, carved into the stone at regular intervals, each one roughly the width of a person, and deep enough that you couldn't see the back of it from where I was standing. I crossed the chamber slowly, stopped about 3 meters out and stood there in the dark with my flashlight off, because something about the way the darkness sat in those alcoves made me not want to announce myself. That's when I heard it. Low. Very low. At the bottom of hearing, the kind of frequency you feel in your chest before you process it as sound. A continuous tone, 8 voices producing it together. And it took me a moment to understand that was what I was hearing, because it didn't sound like voices. It sounded like the building itself vibrating, like the stone was doing it. I crouched against the opposite wall and I waited. 40 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I crouched and checked it again when I finally moved. And 40 minutes is what it said. I wasn't counting them out. I was just staying still and listening and watching the alcoves and making sure that what I thought I was seeing was what I was actually seeing. They were breathing. All 8 of them. I could see it once my eyes had enough time. The slow rise and fall, shallow but regular, each one at their own pace. I moved the flashlight. Every single one of them tracked it. 8 pairs of eyes following the beam as I moved it left, then right, then back. Conscious, all of them. Awake and watching me from inside those carved stone alcoves. I should explain what I mean when I say their bodies were wrong, because wrong is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it doesn't really cover it. You know how in a photograph, if the light is bad or the angle is off, a face can look asymmetrical in ways that don't quite match how the person actually looks. And you assume it's the camera because faces aren't perfectly symmetrical anyway. Nobody's are, and the camera catches them at the wrong moment and makes it look worse than it is. That's what I'd thought about Wesley's photograph. Camera angle, bad light. What I was looking at in those alcoves wasn't a camera angle. One of the men, older, gray-haired, seated with his back against the stone, had a nose that sat wrong on his face. Not broken wrong, not swollen wrong, just positioned slightly off-center, a centimeter or so toward his left cheek, the way furniture looks when someone's moved it and not quite put it back. A woman in the third alcove had a jaw that sat lower on the right side than the left, the asymmetry too consistent and too even to be anything structural, anything she'd been born with. Their features were moving. That's the only way I can say it that's actually accurate. Moving slowly, the way sediment moves in water when the water is almost still. Redistributing, not violently, not painfully, or at least nothing in their faces suggested pain. Just shifting, incrementally, over time. The low tone continued the whole while I was crouched against that wall. 40 minutes of it, sitting at the bottom of my hearing, and somewhere around the 30-minute mark I placed it. It was the same cadence as the fado that came up through the floor of my room every night. Not the same song, not the same performance, the same cadence, the same underlying pulse, the same spacing between the rises and falls of it. I'd been lying on my back above that bar for 3 days, listening to it come up through the floorboards and thinking about the man in the gray coat who sat in the back of the room to hear it. And here it was again, 2 stories underground, coming out of 8 people who may not have been entirely people anymore, in the way I understood the word. I don't know what that meant. I still don't, not entirely. I filed it and kept filing. I didn't photograph anything. I thought about it. I had the phone in my pocket and the flashlight in my hand, and I could have documented every face in those alcoves, every detail, sent the whole thing somewhere before I'd even climbed back out. but something stopped me. Not fear, exactly. More like the sense that photographing them would be doing something to them, making a decision about what they were and what came next. And I wasn't ready to make that decision in the dark under the Convento do Carmo with 40 minutes of observation and no idea what I was looking at. So I left them where they were. I went back the way I'd come, keeping the flashlight low, and climbed the iron rungs back up through the grate and out onto the wet cobblestones of Rua da Oliveira. The night air hit me, and I stood there for a second just breathing it, cold and damp and smelling like the river. I had a client. I had a report to make. Whatever I'd just seen, Rodney Figg had hired me to find something, and I'd found something. And the next step was straightforward enough. I turned up my collar and started walking toward Rua da Saudade. The walk to Rua da Saudade took maybe 20 minutes. Long enough that I had time to think about what I was going to say, which is usually a bad sign. When you need to rehearse the report, it means the report is complicated. And complicated reports come from complicated cases. And I'd taken this one thinking it was straightforward. I hadn't been thinking clearly. That's my way of saying I'd let the money do the thinking for me. The street was quiet when I got there, late enough that the restaurants had closed and early enough that the bars hadn't emptied yet. So there was this gap in the noise, just the sound of my shoes on the cobblestones, and somewhere above me a window open with the television on. I found the building, found the door, rang the bell, waited, rang again. The intercom made a static sound, but nothing came through it. The front door wasn't locked. That should have told me something right there. I went up 2 flights and knocked on the apartment door. Nothing. Knocked again with the side of my fist, and the door moved. Not open, just shifted. The latch not fully caught. I pushed it and stepped inside and stood in the dark for a second with my hand on the frame. Empty. Not empty the way a room is empty when the person's out. Empty the way a room is empty when the person is gone. There's a difference, and you learn to feel it pretty fast in this work. It's in the air, sort of. The absence of accumulated smell. The way sound doesn't dampen the way it does when furniture and clothes and the general debris of living absorbs it. My footsteps came back at me off the walls. I found the light switch, and the overhead bulb came on and confirmed what I already knew. Nothing. No furniture. No rug on the tile floor. No curtains on the windows. Just the bare rods. I walked through to the kitchen, and the counters were clean and the cabinets were open and empty. The refrigerator was unplugged, standing open with the door propped against the wall beside it, the way you leave a fridge when you're not coming back. I stood in the kitchen and tried to work out the timeline. He'd hired me, 5 days ago? 6? And the apartment had been stripped. Not just cleared out in a hurry, but properly stripped. The kind of clearance that takes planning. Which meant he'd known when he sat across from me and counted out those bills that he was already leaving. He'd known the whole time. The note on the back of Andy's card came back to me. My own handwriting. I hadn't called yet. I wasn't sure yet whether this was the kind of thing that couldn't be closed any other way, or whether I was just standing in an empty apartment feeling like an idiot, which wasn't the same thing. I checked the other rooms. A bedroom with marks on the floor where a bed frame had sat. A second room, smaller, with nothing in it at all. A bathroom. I almost missed it. I was doing a last pass, just being thorough the way you are when you already know you're not going to find anything. And I caught my own reflection in the bathroom mirror and noticed it was sitting slightly off the wall. Not much. A few millimeters on the left side. The right side still flush. Like something had been pushed behind it and the mirror hadn't quite settled back. I pulled it open. It was one of those cabinet mirrors, hinged on the right, the kind with shelves inside for razors and aspirin. The shelves were empty, but taped to the back of the mirror itself, to the inside of the door, that's my way of saying, was a photograph. I peeled it off carefully. The tape was old, or at least it had been there long enough to leave a faint residue on the glass. The photograph showed Rodney Figg standing in the cistern. I recognized the alcoves immediately. The curve of the vaulted stone, the particular color of the walls, that dark reddish brown that isn't quite the color of anything else. He was standing beside one of the alcoves, and in the alcove was a figure, and the figure's face had partially collapsed inward, not violently. More like the center of it had softened and drawn toward itself, the nose and the area around the mouth pulling back the way a fruit pulls back when it's been sitting too long. Rodney Figg was looking at the figure. His expression was, I keep coming back to this because it matters, it was attentive. That's the only word that fits. Not horrified, not grieving, not even detached in the way someone might be detached if they'd seen too much and learned to shut themselves off. He was looking at the figure in the alcove the way a man looks at a process he is managing. The way you look at something you are responsible for and are monitoring for progress. There was a date stamp in the corner, 14 months ago. I sat down on the bathroom floor, which tells you something about the state I was in because bathroom floors aren't where you choose to sit when you have other options. I sat there with the photograph in my hand and I let the thing I'd been half thinking since Rodney Figg's arm swung wrong finally finish forming. He hadn't needed someone to find Wesley. He'd needed someone with no prior connection to the cistern, no knowledge of the alcoves, no reason to be suspicious. Someone who would follow a man in a gray coat through the streets of Alfama and Bica and confirm professionally that the grate on Rua de Oliveira was an accessible entrance. That was the whole job, not finding Wesley, confirming the entry point, and the photograph I'd sent him. The door registered to the Fundação para a Ciência e a Tecnologia, the one he'd said wasn't the right entrance, that had given him exactly what he needed, because I'd sent GPS coordinates with it. Because I always send GPS coordinates, it's habit, it saves confusion, and the door being wrong meant the grate was the right entrance, which was the only other thing nearby, which meant I'd handed him the location precisely, and he'd already known what to do with it. 3 days of work. That's what it had taken me to confirm something for a man who already knew what he was looking for, and just needed an outside party to find it independently, officially, without any trail leading back to him. I'd been used, not deceived exactly. He hadn't lied about Wesley. Wesley was down there. But the case I'd thought I was working wasn't the case he'd hired me for. And there's a kind of lie in that, even if every individual fact he told me was true. I got up off the bathroom floor. My knees were stiff from the cistern and from crouching on cold stone for 40 minutes, and the floor hadn't helped. I went back to the kitchen. The phone was on the counter. I'd walked past it twice without registering it because I'd been looking for absence, not presence, and it was the only thing in the apartment that wasn't absent. A plain handset, nothing on the screen, battery probably low. I picked it up, turned it over, put it in my jacket pocket. I didn't have a reason yet. That's honest. I wasn't leaving it there. Whatever was on it, whatever record of communications or contacts or instructions, it connected to something I was already connected to, whether I wanted to be or not. And leaving it felt like leaving something of mine behind. That's not logical. I know that. But I took it. I stood in the empty kitchen for another minute with the photograph in one hand and the shape of the whole thing settling over me. Rodney Figg was gone. He'd been gone before I knocked. The apartment had been a prop, a mailing address, a place to hand over cash and present a story. And now the story was done, and he'd walked out of it and left me standing in the set. The photograph went into my inside breast pocket, behind the notebook. I turned off the kitchen light and went back down the stairs and out onto Rua da Saudade. And the street was still quiet, and the television was still on in the window above me. And I stood there for a second on the cobblestones thinking about 8 people in stone alcoves under the Convento do Carmo and a man with a careful, attentive expression who had already moved on to whatever came next. The grate was where I'd left it. That sounds obvious, but it mattered. I'd half expected it to be gone, sealed, moved, some other sign that Rodney Figg had already swept the board clean. It was still there in the cobblestones on Rua da Oliveira, just a square of dark iron with a recessed lip. And I crouched over it for a second, listening to the street before I got my fingers under the edge and pulled. I went down slower than the night before. Not careful exactly. More like I wasn't in a hurry to arrive. The smell hit first. The same mineral cold, stone and standing water, and something underneath that I still don't have a word for. Something biological but not rotten. More like the smell of a place where something is growing rather than decaying. The ladder rungs were slick, and I kept my weight back on my heels until my feet found the floor. I stood in the dark for a moment before I turned the flashlight on. Not for any tactical reason. I just needed a second. Then I clicked it on and swept it low across the floor the way I had the night before, keeping the beam off the alcoves until I was ready. The channels were still running, that thin black water moving slow through the carved grooves in the stone. The vaulted ceiling disappeared above the edge of the light. Everything exactly as I'd left it, which was the thing about this place. It was the kind of space where nothing changed unless something made it change. And whatever was making it change was operating on a timescale I couldn't see. I moved to the far wall and started at the left end. 8 alcoves. I photographed them in order, left to right, working methodically because methodical was the only thing I had to offer. I kept the flashlight steady and gave each one enough light to come out clear on the camera. I didn't linger. I didn't look too long. The first figure was a woman, middle-aged, I thought, though it was hard to be certain given what was happening to her face. Her jaw had shifted further since the night before. Or maybe the angle was different. Maybe I was just seeing it more clearly now that I was looking for it. She didn't react to the light. Her eyes were open and tracking, but she didn't move, just held whatever position she'd been in. Her breathing so slow I had to watch her chest for 10 seconds before I was sure. I moved to the second alcove. A man, older. His nose migrated toward his left cheek in that way I'd noticed the night before. He tracked the light when I moved it. That was the thing that kept catching me. They were all in there, behind whatever was happening to the outside, watching. I moved to the third alcove from the left. I recognized Wesley Figg from the photograph Zoe Gray had given me, though recognizing him took a second because the photograph had been taken 2 days before he disappeared, and 6 weeks had passed since then. His hair was the same, dark, and his build was the same, slender, but his face had progressed further than any of the others. Both ears were lower now, not just the left one. His features had a quality of, I don't know how to put this exactly, of redistribution, like someone had pressed gently on the center of his face and everything was slowly moving outward toward the edges. His skin was waxy, the way the synopsis had it, slack in a way that skin isn't supposed to be slack on someone his age. I raised the camera. He turned his head, not fast. The movement took 3 or 4 seconds, which is a long time for a head to turn. And it didn't move the way a head moves when the neck is doing the work. It moved from somewhere deeper, some internal mechanism I couldn't name, like watching a compass needle find north. Slow, deliberate, pulled by something other than muscle. He turned until he was looking directly at the flashlight, at me. And then he shook his head. Slow. The same deliberate quality. Once to the left, once to the right, back to center. He held my gaze the whole time. Or what was left of his gaze, those dark eyes still tracking even when everything around them had shifted. I lowered the camera. I stood there looking at him for what felt like a long time. The low tone the 8 of them produced together was in my chest more than my ears, that frequency that sat below hearing and just registered as pressure. I'd heard it every night through the floor of my room above the Fado bar without knowing what it was, and now I was standing inside it and it felt different in here, more present. like standing inside the instrument rather than outside it. Wesley Figg kept his eyes on me. The refusal was clear. I understood that. Whatever was happening in the alcoves had progressed far enough that Wesley Figg knew exactly what he was doing, knew I was holding a camera, knew what I was about to send and to whom, and had made his position plain in the only way available to him. That's not a small thing. That's someone with agency, even now, even in whatever state he was in. That deserves to be taken seriously. I also knew I'd already let someone else's certainty guide my hands once in the last week, and that had ended with me standing in a stripped apartment, holding a photograph that told me I'd been used as a tool by a man who was already 3 steps ahead, acting on incomplete information, walking away because Wesley Figg shook his head without knowing what the head shaking meant, whether it was refusal or acceptance or something I didn't have a framework for. That was just being used a different way, by my own ignorance this time instead of someone else's planning. But the result would be the same. 8 people in stone alcoves under a city, and nobody who knew they were there except a man who had already left. I raised the camera again and photographed Wesley Figg. He didn't look away. He didn't shake his head a second time. He just held whatever he held, that slow, steady gaze while the shutter clicked. I moved to the 4th alcove and kept going. I worked through all 8, and then I stood in the center of the cistern with the camera in my hand and looked back at the row of them. All 8 sets of eyes open, all 8 chests moving in that slow, synchronized rhythm, all 8 contributing to that pressure in my sternum that wasn't quite sound. I thought about what Andy Santiago would do when he came down here. I thought about whether his framework, evidence, protocol, chain of custody, whatever the Policia Judiciaria brought to bear on a situation, would be adequate for what he was going to find. I genuinely didn't know. I still don't. But Andy Santiago had institutional authority and investigative resources and a legal mandate, and I had 8 photographs on a camera and a GPS reading and a card in my jacket pocket that I'd been carrying for 6 weeks without knowing I'd need it. I pulled the card out. My own handwriting on the back. Do not call unless the case cannot be closed any other way. I looked at it for a second in the flashlight's edge glow. The card was a little soft at the corners from sitting in my pocket. Andy Santiago's direct number was on the front, desk and mobile both, and I'd never used either one since the case 2 years back that had put his card in my possession in the first place. That case I'd closed the regular way. This one I couldn't. I held the card and looked at the 8 alcoves and thought about Wesley Figg's slow, deliberate refusal, and about Rodney Figg's careful, attentive expression in the photograph behind the bathroom mirror, and about the fact that whatever process was underway in these stone chambers had been underway for at least 14 months that I could document, probably longer than that, and that Rodney Figg had already moved to preserve it by moving the people inside it somewhere I didn't know. The card stayed in my hand. I typed Andy Santiago's mobile number into Rodney Figg's phone. Not my phone. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about how I handled the next few minutes. I was standing in the dark at the bottom of a 2,000-year-old cistern, sending photographs of 8 people whose faces were slowly redistributing across their skulls. And I was doing it from a phone that belonged to the man who had put them there. There's something almost funny about that if you're the kind of person who finds that sort of thing funny. I'm not particularly, but I noticed it. The signal down there was weak. 1 bar, sometimes none. I'd found it earlier, moving around the chamber with the phone held up, trying angles the way you do in bad reception areas, which is a stupid thing to do and doesn't work, but you do it anyway. There was a spot near the secondary passage on the far end of the chamber where the signal steadied to 2 bars, which wasn't good but was workable. I went back to that spot and stood there with the phone and the card and the flashlight clamped under my arm, pointing at the ceiling, and I started sending. 8 photographs, each one a face. I sent them individually because I didn't trust the connection to hold through a grouped send, and I watched each one upload with that slow, grinding progress bar that felt like it was taking longer than it should. which it probably was. The chamber was quiet except for the water and the low tone the 8 of them were still producing, and I tried not to think about the fact that I was standing close enough to hear it clearly now, that low, continuous cadence sitting just under the threshold where sound becomes something you hear with your chest instead of your ears. After the photographs, I sent the coordinates, just the numbers, copied out of the phone's location function and pasted into the message field. No text before or after. I looked at the empty message field for a moment and thought about what I could write that would help Andy understand what he was walking into. And I couldn't find anything that would do the job without also doing things I didn't want to do. Connecting my name to this, explaining how I'd come to be standing here, giving him a thread that ran back through Rodney Fig and the empty apartment on Rua da Saudade, and 3 nights watching a bar on Rua da Bica, and a photograph of a young man whose ear had already started to slide. All of that was mine to carry, not his. Or anyway, that's what I told myself. I sent it, watched the message status tick over to delivered, stood there another few seconds to make sure it didn't bounce back. Then I held the phone over the water channel running along the base of the wall and let it go. It hit with a flat sound, not much of a splash, and the screen lit up once underwater. A pale rectangle of light in the black water, and then went dark. I watched the spot where it had been for a moment. The channel was maybe 4 inches deep, but the current in it, if you could call it that, was slow enough that the phone probably wasn't going anywhere. It would just sit there. At some point, Andy's people would find it, if they looked, which they would. And they'd pull it out and try to recover whatever was on it, which they might manage. And the communications between Rodney Fig and whoever else he'd been talking to would be gone, which was the point, and the record of his voice message to me, "That isn't the right entrance, keep looking," would be gone with it, which was the cost. I knew that when I dropped it. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't confused about what I was trading away. The phone was the one object that placed Rodney Fig in direct contact with this case, and it was also the one object that might have helped Andy Santiago understand what kind of man he was looking for and what that man had been doing for at least 14 months. Probably longer. I dropped it anyway because the alternative was handing Andy a thread that ran straight back to me, and I wasn't ready to be at the end of that thread. Not then. Maybe not ever. That's not a clean thing to say about yourself. I know that. I found the secondary passage by feel more than by sight, crouching low and moving along the far wall until the stone opened up into a narrower channel, maybe 4 feet high, that ran at a slight upward angle toward the surface. I'd clocked it earlier on my way through, filed it away the way you do when you're in an unfamiliar space and you want to know your exits. Old habit. The kind of thing that becomes automatic after enough years of going into places where you're not supposed to be, and needing to leave them faster than you entered. The passage was tight enough that I had to take the jacket off and carry it, pulling myself forward with my forearms against the stone. The flashlight went in my teeth. The stone smelled like old water and something underneath that. Mineral, cold, the smell of things that have been sealed away from air for a very long time, and haven't entirely adjusted to being opened again. Not a bad smell, just old. The kind of old that makes you feel like a very recent development. It opened onto a set of worn stone steps that came up through a grate on Calzada de Duque, and I pushed the grate up and climbed out into the pre-dawn city. The air hit me first, cool and moving, smelling of the river a few streets over, and the particular smell of Lisbon in the hour before the city wakes up, which is bread from somewhere and old stone and something faintly electrical that I've never been able to identify. I stood on the cobblestones and pulled my jacket back on and looked up the hill toward the Barro Alto and down toward the Chiato, and didn't move for a moment. I was not going back to the room above the Fado bar. That thought had been sitting in the back of my head since the apartment on Rua da Saudade. Since I'd stood in the empty bathroom holding the photograph of Rodney Fig in the alcoves and understood what the case had actually been, my license was registered to the room. Rodney Fig had known the address since the first night. I'd given it to him myself. The way you give a client your contact details. The way you don't think twice about, because why would you? Because at that point he was just a man with a stiff arm and a missing son and an envelope of bills. He'd had the address for days. He'd had time to do whatever he wanted with it. And Andy would trace the anonymous tip within 48 hours, maybe less. He was good at his job, which was one of the reasons I'd used him, and one of the reasons I couldn't be at that address when he arrived. The license was already gone. The room was already gone. Both of those things had been true since the moment I dropped the phone into the water, maybe since earlier than that. Maybe since the moment I'd followed the man in the gray coat down through the grate on Rua de Oliveira and seen what was in the alcoves. Some decisions closed doors behind them without making any noise about it. I picked a direction and started walking. Not toward anything in particular, just away from the grate, away from Calçada do Duque. Moving because standing still wasn't useful, and because the city was quiet enough at that hour. That movement felt like the only honest response to it. The cobblestones were slick from a mist that had come in off the river at some point while I was underground, and my shoes were wet through by the time I reached the bottom of the hill. I didn't have much with me. The jacket, the photographs of the 8 faces on my own phone, the Andy Santiago card which I'd kept out of some reflex I couldn't explain, and the photograph from behind the bathroom mirror, which was still in my inside pocket, slightly bent from where I'd folded it wrong in the dark. I walked. The city was just starting to make its first sounds, a shutter going up somewhere, a motorbike 2 streets over, a bird somewhere high up that had decided the dark was close enough to over. I didn't have a destination. That was fine. Destination was a problem for a few hours from now, and a few hours from now was far enough away that I didn't have to look at it yet. The steps of the Igreja de São Domingos are cold through your trousers even in May, and they're not smooth. Centuries of foot traffic have worn them into shallow, irregular dips that don't match any particular human body. I found a spot near the bottom, off to the left of the main doors, where a section of stone jutted out far enough to sit on without sliding, and I put myself there and watched the square begin to fill. That's the honest version of it. I sat down because my legs were done and I didn't have anywhere else to be. The Muraria was waking up slow. A woman in a yellow coat crossed the square with a shopping bag, not looking at anything. A man on a bicycle cut through at an angle and disappeared down one of the lanes that run off toward the Castello. The light was that particular early morning gray that isn't quite dawn but has stopped being night. The kind of light that makes everything look provisional, like the city is still deciding what it wants to look like today. I'd been underground long enough that the open sky felt strange. Too much of it. I kept noticing it above the roof lines and then looking away. The first tourists showed up around the time the light started going yellow. 2 of them, a couple with matching jackets and a camera that looked expensive enough that carrying it around Lisbon at dawn seemed like a bad idea. They stood in the middle of the square and took photographs of the church facade. Then they took photographs of each other in front of the church facade. Then one of them photographed the other one photographing the facade, which I watched for longer than I should have because there was something in it I couldn't quite name. Not irony, not stupidity, just this particular human need to document the fact of being somewhere, to prove it happened. I thought about Wesley Figg shaking his head. Not for the first time. I'd been thinking about it since I climbed out of that secondary passage onto Calçada do Duque, and I hadn't gotten anywhere new with it in the interim. The movement had been slow. The way everything he did was slow now. His neck working from whatever internal mechanism had replaced the ordinary business of muscle and nerve. But the intention behind it had been clear. That was the part I kept turning over. Not the movement itself, but the clarity of it. He had looked at my flashlight, understood what I was and what I represented, and said no, deliberately, without distress. Which meant either he understood exactly what was happening to him and had made his peace with it, Or he understood exactly what was happening to him and had decided that whatever came next was preferable to whatever Andy Santiago's people would do when they arrived. I couldn't tell which one. I'm still not sure it matters, or I'm not sure the distinction is one I'm qualified to make. More tourists arrived. A group of 4, younger, with phones out before they'd even stopped walking. One of them crouched to photograph the cobblestones at a low angle, which I understood. The cobblestones in this part of the city are genuinely worth photographing. The old black and white pattern. The way they curve slightly at the edges of the square. I'd noticed them myself on my first week here before they became just the surface I walked on every day. My investigative license was registered to the room above the Fado bar. Past tense, probably, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. Andy Santiago would trace the anonymous tip to that address inside 2 days. He's methodical, always was, and he had enough to work backward from even without the phone. The room was already gone in any practical sense. I'd known that when I chose not to go back to it. What I hadn't worked out yet was what came after the room. I had the jacket, the photographs on my own phone, the Andy Santiago card, and the photograph from behind Rodney Figg's bathroom mirror. The last one was still in my inside pocket, slightly bent from where I'd folded it wrong in the dark. I hadn't looked at it since the cistern. I didn't take it out now. Rodney Figg had been gone before I even found the empty apartment. He'd had everything he needed from me. The confirmation of the grate, a photograph of the nearby door that told him the street-level approach was observable and therefore needed to change. And he'd moved on whatever came next. I'd been a tool for a specific purpose, and the purpose was complete. The fact that I hadn't known I was being used for it didn't change what I'd actually done. I'd spent 3 days locating an entrance to a place where 8 people were being kept in circumstances I didn't have language for, and I'd handed that information to the man who was keeping them there. The tourists with the matching jackets were gone. New ones had taken their place. A family now, 2 adults, and a child who immediately began climbing the church steps, which the parents allowed until the child reached the 3rd step and then didn't allow. The child sat down on the 3rd step in protest. I recognized the logic of it. The thing about the note on the back of Andy Santiago's card. Do not call unless the case cannot be closed any other way. Is that I'd written it to protect Andy, not myself. 2 years ago, the case that introduced us had ended in a way that made further contact professionally inconvenient for him, and the note was my acknowledgement of that. A reminder not to drag him into things that weren't his problem. Last night I'd used it as a justification to drag him into something that was very much not his problem. And I'd done it without explanation, without context, without any of the information that would have helped him understand what he was walking toward. Whether that was the right call was a question I didn't have a clean answer to. The case was closed in the only sense I could close it. I'd found Wesley Figg. I'd found the other 7. I'd reported their location to the only authority available to me. Rodney Figg had hired me to confirm an entrance, and I'd confirmed it. And then I turned the confirmation into a different kind of report and sent it somewhere Rodney Figg couldn't intercept it. Whether that balanced out was not a calculation I was capable of running objectively, and I knew it. And I sat there on the cold stone anyway, and tried to run it. The light had gone fully yellow by now, the kind of morning light that makes old stone look like it's generating warmth from the inside. The square was filling steadily. More tourists, a few locals cutting through with the purposeful walk of people who have somewhere to be. A man setting up a small table near the far edge with what looked like postcards. The city was doing what cities do, which is to say it was continuing, regardless. Somewhere below the streets, in stone chambers that had been standing since before anyone in this square's bloodline had learned to read, 8 people were breathing. Andy Santiago had the coordinates. He would either understand what he found or he wouldn't, and either way, he would do what the institution he worked for required him to do. And whatever that was, it was no longer something I could influence. Wesley Figg had shaken his head. I'd photographed him anyway. I stayed on the steps for a while after that thought, not because sitting there was useful, but because getting up required deciding where to go, and I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. The child on the third step had been retrieved by its parents and was now being carried across the square in the direction of a cafe that had just put its chairs out. The man with the postcards was doing slow business. A pigeon landed 2 steps below me, looked at me with the complete indifference that pigeons have developed over centuries of coexisting with humans who have nowhere to be, and then left. The question of whether I'd done right by Wesley Figg or by the other 7 was still open. I didn't expect it to close. Some questions are like that. They don't resolve. They just become part of the furniture. Something you move around for the rest of your life without ever quite putting it somewhere that makes sense. I got up eventually, straightened my jacket. The photograph from behind the bathroom mirror shifted in my inside pocket when I moved, the bent corner catching against the lining. The city was already busy enough that I could walk in any direction and disappear into it, which was what I needed and what I did.